I'm Tony Burton. I'm the chair of CPRE London, and CPRE London has organised this evening's event on behalf of the More Natural Capital Coalition, which is a group of 20 environmental charities working across the capital. And you can see who they are by their logos on the various posters that are around the room. Welcome also to our large online audience. The interest in this evening's event is testament to the important role the Mayor can play on the environment and the significant powers and influence they wield. So I'm sure you'll offer a warm welcome to our mayoral candidates and representatives. We have with us Emma Best from the Conservatives, Rob Blackie from the Liberal Democrats, Zoe Garbett from the Greens, and we will be joined shortly by Leonie Cooper from Labour. For those of you who are in the room, can you just take note of the emergency exits? One where you came in and one through here. The toilet's also through there on the left. And no, there are no fire alarms planned for the evening. And please be aware that the event is being filmed. The format of the evening is as follows. Each candidate's going to give you a 3-minute opening statement. And they'll do this in alphabetical order, unless one of them doesn't turn up. Emma, Rob, Leonie, and Zoe. They know that 3 minutes means 3 minutes, and I will stop people after the 3 minutes are up. I will then ask a few questions which have been submitted in advance by environmental charities, and to try and keep the candidates' response to those to just 1 minute. It's then time for audience questions. I'll ask you to raise your hands and briefly introduce yourself if you are in the room. And if you are online, then please put your questions in the chat. Please stick to making questions and avoid making speeches. We will wrap up with 1 minute closing statements from the candidates in the opposite order. So it'll be Zoe, Leonie, Rob, and Emma. And we plan to end by 8:15. We're all ready to go? Drum roll. Then let's have the first of the statements. So, Emma, I think you're up first.
Okay.
Go for it.
Good evening, everyone. It's really lovely to see so many familiar faces, and thank you everyone for turning out tonight for what's a really important event. So as you probably noticed, my name is Emma Best and I'm not Susan Hall. So my apologies that Susan couldn't be with us tonight, but her schedule, she'd already committed to another event. So apologies for that, but you do have me, and I've taken off my green jumper so you don't confuse me with Zoe. I am the Conservative representative here this evening, and I've been representing the Conservatives on the Environment Committee within the London Assembly as an Assembly member since 2021. I was driven into politics by the environment and wanting to do everything I could and be a strong voice on that. So while I might not be Susan Hall, if she does become mayor, I will be the thorn in her side, telling her to go further and do more for our natural capital. So Susan wanted to let you know what is key to her campaign is listening to Londoners, and she wants that to be putting that at the very centre of everything that she does. And that doesn't mean just listening to those who shout louder or who have the biggest platform. That means listening to everyone and making sure that everybody's views are heard. She's extremely passionate about London and its green spaces. Some of you may know, is a mother and grandchild, so actually taking her kids out in that green space and being able to do things in a natural capital, something that we all take for granted now, but want to keep forever and make sure it keeps as well as it would be, and we expand, is something that's really important to her. And that's why the manifesto tonight has so many good ideas, which I know she wants to champion. Part of that is her pollution hotspot money for £50 million, which she's announced. And that can go into things like changing road layouts at pollution hotspots, looking into solving that last mile. And this has been a particular thorn I've been in her side, is when you live in outer London, like I do, it's that last mile that really kills people and makes them have to take another option of getting home, which isn't as sustainable. So things like increasing Santander spikes and other sustainable methods in transport in outer London, as well as garden streets, which I see is another important commitment here in the manifesto. One thing that Susan's been really clear about is she won't promise anything that she can't deliver. So what you see will happen. And when she gets in there, she wants to have the experts, some of those that we see tonight, and many of these organisations I know have worked closely on will be forming part of bigger and more bolder plans once she gets into office and knows exactly what she can deliver for Londoners. Now, I really look forward to the discussion tonight and exploring some of your questions and your comments disguised as questions, and seeing what I can do to convince you of Susan Hall and the Conservative manifesto for the 2024 mayoral election. Thank you.
Thank you, Emma. Thanks for sticking to time. Rob.
Good evening. First of all, thank you to everyone here for bothering to come along tonight. The work that everyone in this room does helps make London more environmentally friendly every day. I started campaigning on environmental issues back in the 1980s. And for those of you with a long memory, you'll remember that we would have been seen doing that as being a bit weird back then. Maybe sometimes we are today, some of us. So it looked really quite niche when I trained as an environmental economist. And I started my career working on elephant conservation in Namibia. And working with local communities in rural African communities, we managed to increase the elephant population by 12,000. Now, you're probably thinking at this point, what on earth is he talking about elephant conservation for? Well, I think there's something very important there, which is if we don't involve people in solving environmental problems, we won't be successful. And that's something I've seen throughout my career. I've worked with UN on climate change, where the amazing head of the UN on climate change, Christiana Figueres, spent a decade traveling the world, explaining to people that they could actually have a new washing machine and tackle climate change, and getting people on board fixing environmental problems. And that's why, as mayoral candidate, I am pledging things to make things easier for people, whether or not it's more electric car charging or making it easier for people to get solar on their roofs. We also need to stop doing stupid things. We need to stop doing things like expanding London's airports. And of course, Liberal Democrats, we have opposed the Mayor's Silvertown Tunnel, the motorway in East London that he is building right now. And finally, we need to boost biodiversity, or as normal people would call it, birds and bugs. That's why yesterday I pledged to have a huge expansion of the number of allotments in London. Allotments give people incredible joy in London, but they're also fantastic for biodiversity because of the biodiversity of the plants, and of course, because of the messiness in the compost heaps. And that's where I'm going to ask for your help in the future, which is spreading the word that messiness is good. Working with Liberal Democrat councils in London who've encouraged more biodiverse policies, people see the messiness as somehow a council going wrong. I think I'm relying on you and your friends helping people to understand that's actually fantastic for London. So thanks so much for coming along tonight. I'm going to look forward to our discussions. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob. Now, Zoe, are you okay to go next?
Yeah.
And then we'll follow Leonie, obviously, at opening statements. So welcome.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you to CPRE for organising these hustings and for all the organisations that have put forward this fantastic manifesto and for being a real voice for nature in this election. I was lucky to grow up immersed in nature. I was one of the first Girl Scouts, and I remember sleeping out under the stars and making shelters in the woodlands. My parents were teachers, which has given me a really strong sense of public duty and a care for the public sector, which I spent over 10 years working in senior roles in public health, adult social care, children's health services in the NHS, managing multi-million-pound budgets, as well as huge projects, one of which most recently was the green plans, making the NHS net zero, of which ranged from rewilding GP car parks up to convincing senior executives that the climate emergency is a health emergency and that health is intrinsically linked to the health of our planet. The same values that drew me to the public sector drew me to the Green Party, which I joined in 2014, and I was elected as a councillor in Hackney with the strongest Green vote in London. This is because I act on what people tell me and I deliver for my residents. I've made a huge difference in Hackney, and I'm really excited to be able to do the same across London. Greens have got a history and a legacy of protecting nature. as well as doing that here on the London Assembly, from Jenny Jones to our wonderful Assembly members, 2 of which are in the room, I'm proud to say that I'm fully committing to all the pledges within the manifesto. We need to recognise that we're in a climate emergency and can do as much as we can to address it. From everyone, from the policies we have around housing, so making sure we're providing affordable homes to people, but not costing nature in addressing this. So we need to buy up existing homes and build on brownfield land and absolutely protect our green belt. I want to cut the daily living costs and address inequality. No one should have to worry about the cost of living, and this includes addressing food poverty. So I've committed to extending free school meals for secondary school children, but also committing to all the wonderful things in this manifesto around food growing, allotments, orchards, and farms, so that every child has the opportunity to get their hands dirty and to learn about food. Because we know that for people to protect nature, they need to have access to it. They need to be able to fall in love with it. And that starts with us providing ways that people can engage with nature, be out and about, see that in their everyday, create and connect nature so people can live and be amongst it. So it's really important time to be voting Green. I'm part of the Green Party because I know that the climate emergency needs to be addressed, and the bio and ecological emergency is at the heart of that too. Green, the support for Greens is growing across the country. We're 3rd in London for the past decade, and I'd really appreciate your support in this election. Thank you.
Thank you, Zoe. So just over to Leonie. Leonie, just so you know, 3 minutes, and we're sticking to the 3 minutes. So over to you.
Thank you. And it's great to see so many people here this evening, and I know it's also being webcast. I'm here representing Sadiq Khan, who is the current Mayor of London and was first elected in 2016. And I think since then has demonstrated that he completely understands the risks that London and Londoners face as a result of climate change, which is the big issue of our times. And also alongside and part of that, ecological collapse. That's why Sadiq has set ambitious targets that London should reach net zero by 2030. London is already seeing the impacts of the climate emergency. In the summer of 22, we experienced 40-degree heat waves. We've also had flash flooding as a result of all the water that's now able to stay in the atmosphere. This is putting huge pressure on Londoners and also our emergency services. So that's why I'm really proud to be here to speak on behalf of Sadiq Khan. I feel we have a mayor who really understands why the environment needs to be a top priority. The mayor's environment strategy and also the London plan include policies that aim to prevent nature depletion and increase biodiversity and green spaces across the city. And Sadiq has prioritised protecting and expanding London's green spaces. This is vital for the health and well-being, not just of nature, but also for the health of Londoners, and also will help us just to as we face higher temperatures, we have the urban heat island effect. So the more nature we have in the city, the more able we will be to adapt, and it will mitigate some of the worst of climate change. Since taking office, Sadiq has invested more than 30 million in green spaces and in tree planting, has planted 500,000 trees or restored the equivalent of more than 300 football pitches of habitat for London's wildlife. He's also rewilded the city. He's brought beavers back to Ealing, bees to Bexley and bats to Barnes. And in 2019, London became the world's first national park city and has now been joined by a few others. He's also focused on making active travel, walking and cycling easier, with cycle routes having quadrupled over the first 2 terms. Helps humans, but also helps biodiversity. So we've seen all of that happening up until now, but there's so much more work that needs to be done, which is one of the reasons why Sadiq wants to stand again and to achieve an unprecedented 3rd term as the Mayor of London. If he's re-elected, he'll prioritise cleaning the rivers and adding that to all of the other work that he's been doing. And he's really excited at being able to do that. However, it's really important that even if you do support the Green Party or the Liberal Democrat Party, normally that you lend your vote to Sadiq Khan for the mayorship. because the Conservatives have just changed the voting system.
George, we're closed, yeah.
And it is a straight fight between the Conservatives and Labour.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Right, following those opening statements, thank you to all the candidates. We've got 5 questions which have come in from some of the environmental charities in advance. So I'm going to read those out and ask each of the candidates to spend maybe a minute or a maximum to respond to them. And then we'll move into an open question session with the audience in the room and online. So the first one that's come in is from River Action. We've recently seen Thames water blasted as the popular wild swimming spot, Teddington Lock, has been flooded with sewage. This is not a unique situation. Will you commit to cleaning up our waterways as an urgent priority? And how do you plan to address this crisis? We could ask maybe Rob to respond first to that.
Thank you. Dirty rivers are a long-term problem for London, and it's something we Liberal Democrats have been campaigning on for long term. We campaigned on the Thames Tideway Tunnel to get the big super sewer built. We started campaigning 20 years ago. We succeeded in winning that campaign 10 years ago, and it opens next year. That will help, but we're keeping up the fight to keep pressure on the water companies to clean up the water where the sewage goes into the tributaries of the Thames. And we've got to keep up that fight because they've been structured financially to make it very, very easy for them to come up with excuses for not investing that money. So we're going to keep on fighting in all the ways that we need to. That means testing the water properly to show where the water companies are not keeping to their pledges. It means stopping ridiculous schemes like the scheme for more abstractions at Teddington Lock, which would of course tear up a local nature reserve. And of course it means working to get more water absorbed before getting into the sewers in the first place.
Okay, thank you, Rob. Could I move on to Emma?
Thank you. Yeah, I think this is going to be one of the biggest challenges perhaps in the next 15 to 20 years. And I was actually speaking earlier with somebody about just how scary the prospect of our dirty water or lack of water is. And it's going to be the next challenge, not only in working with those water companies, but it's going to be the next challenge of whoever the next mayor is, to convince the public of that and to really have that straightforward conversation, which allows people to understand quite how close we are to a really desperate situation with water in London. And I think this goes hand in hand with a number of issues. I think Robbie just mentioned there. We also need to look at leakage and tackling that with Thames Water and in partnership with water companies within London. But the other thing as well, I think, is in the planning system. And currently the planning system is not very conjoined with looking at public infrastructure. And so where developments, especially large developments, are in place, that doesn't particularly work well with our current water infrastructure or power infrastructure. And part of that needs to change. And I think the mayor has a lot of convening power. And I think hopefully that's something that Susan will be able to pick up. And that will be a massive challenge, not just for the next mayor, but like I say, the next 15 to 20 years. But it's going to take a really strong relationship with the water companies. But it's also going to need to be the mayor using convening powers, using the London Plan in order to make sure that where we are approving developments, we're making sure that the infrastructure for clean and available water is there for the next generation.
Great, thank you, Emma. Zoe.
I think this is absolutely horrific that we've allowed the companies to pollute our waterways and not so people aren't able to swim in them, and it's suffocating our biodiversity and wildlife. Nationally, so as a national party, one of our policies is to nationalise the waterways and get those under public ownership to be able to run them properly and to keep our rivers and seas clean. I also think locally we need to be holding Thames Water much more to account to deliver what we need in London and to make sure that this isn't happening. I also think we need to be investing more in the natural filtration. I visited Thames 21 and all the great work they're doing in Enfield. you know, creating really beautiful areas for people to spend time, but also that natural filtration of, you know, road runoff and other things to make sure, and that's, you know, that's stuff that we could be doing now, like to address cleaning up water here. But I do think it's about nationalising the waterways, holding Thames Water to account, and then doing natural filtration here. Thank you.
Thank you. Leonie.
So I think the completion of the Thames Tideway Tunnel on time and actually pretty much on budget is going to be a real help in terms of cleaning up London's river and also some of the adjoining rivers as well. However, what more can be done beyond that? And it's obvious that there is a lot more in terms of the monitoring that Thames Water has been installing, and they need to have monitors everywhere. Rob was talking about the situation that's grown up with the water companies. One of the real problems with the water companies has also been an absolute failure of regulation by Ofwat, which has just simply not had enough teeth. The other body that has actually had staff removed from it has been the Environment Agency. And it's quite clear that the Environment Agency needs to have its teeth put back in, and it needs to have the staff who are there to enable that regulation of the water companies and monitoring of what they're up to taking place. The Mayor has recently convened, as a result of the flooding in London, the Surface Water Strategy Group, and that is bringing together the boroughs across London, the Environment Agency, and all the bodies that need to be in the room together. And I think that is going to start to pay dividends as it moves forward. And that's why in my opening remarks, I said that the Mayor wants to make continuing the cleanup of London's rivers part of his ongoing set of targets if he's re-elected from the 2nd of May, so that the reintroduction of water voles can follow beavers. We can't be introducing these things into filth.
Thank you. Thanks, Leonie. Right, thanks to the candidates for that. Hopefully River Action will be happy with the variety of responses. The second question is from the London Wetlands Centre. Access to nature is an important issue for people's health and well-being. What is your understanding of current access to nature within London? And what will you do to address the gap between those with the most and the least access? And I'll ask Zoe to kick off on that one. Thanks.
Thank you. So inequality is what drives me. It's what I came into politics, and it's why I came into the NHS. And it infuriates me that we live in a world that is very unequal. So rebalancing people's access to nature and doing that in a fair way is at the heart of my approach. I know that disproportionately Black communities have less access to green space, and obviously there's a poverty gap as well with people who are stuck in flats that don't have access to green space. I've been out and about with some of the nature organisations, visiting some of the wetlands and nature reserves we've got all around the city. So I think it's all about making sure that people have access to those through transport and making sure that that's available, but also making sure that we're liberating some of our green spaces that have been trapped behind fences. I know that's a big campaign from CPRE to create 10 more natural new parks, which is a commitment that I've signed up to. And this is all about making sure these places are made available and have access to and can be rewilded and accessed by children to play in and people to access on their doorstep. And making sure that I would solidify that within the new London plan as park opportunity sites. So currently we've got that kind of designation for things like regeneration, but we need a nature designation too, so we can provide parks and rebalance that inequality in access.
Thank you. Thanks, Zoe. Leonie.
We're going to go along the table. Sorry, so I put the microphone for
I'm going to randomise this.
Oh, you've randomised this. So one of the things that I was really proud that we were able to achieve was the National Park City status, and I was really glad that Sadiq Khan decided to champion that. And it's a really interesting organisation that is now accrediting other cities around the world. And one of its main things that it wants to do is to make sure that people know where nature is, people want to get involved in nature, people want to get their hands dirty, and people can enjoy it. Alongside continuing to support the National Park City and the National Park City Foundation, Sadiq introduced the Green and Resilient Spaces Fund for large-scale greening projects. There's going to be more more green and wild spaces throughout London if he is re-elected. And the London plan, it has those protections in it at the moment, and we're going to be working up the London Nature Recovery Strategy, and it will be focusing on these as well. The Rowback Greener Fund has provided almost £3.5 million of funding to over 100 local, very local community projects to plant trees, to provide shade, create and improve green spaces and boost climate resilience. The projects are located in neighbourhoods that have had poor access to green space, because we do recognise that some Londoners find it a lot easier to get into nature than others. So it's really, really important to get it into those areas where there's a lower canopy cover and higher levels of deprivation.
Thanks, Leonie. Emma?
Thank you. I love this keeping us on the toes, moving around the table. I have to say as well quickly, this is the most conscientious hosting audience I've ever been. I think they're making more notes than me, and thank you everyone for that. But it does make me slightly wary. I think one of the things I wanted to say was when I remember doing some of these hustings at the last mayoral election, they were all online, and because we were in that COVID period, of course. And of course, there were so many bad things during COVID, but one of the great things was that people actually got out in their local areas and discovered green spaces on their doorstep that they never knew were there. And one of the things I think it's really important in the first part of the question is, why is it important, this access to nature? And we saw the saviour that those green spaces were for people's mental health in a really, really difficult time in London. But what we also found was the places where you had walkways which were overgrown and been unloved for so long, especially if anybody has come up towards the Epping Forest side of London, the amount of access points that simply have just been unloved for so long that people are being trapped from these amazing pieces of nature. So that's one of the really important things that I think Susan will be trying to do, is increasing everybody's access to nature and making sure that we clear some of these walkways and make sure all pedestrians get that access that everybody should have across London. She's also committed to protecting the green belt at all costs, so there'd be no green belt development. And of course, I think this is a point I'll probably come back to, but it is about listening to Londoners. It is about working with the organisations here tonight on those promises about how we can increase national parks. And that's going to be one of the really key points. It's not getting mates in to do the jobs, it's getting the experts in, like people in this room, to increase our access to nature in London.
It's a conscientious bunch, so they'll be the right people to bring in.
I know, I'm very impressed.
Rob, over to you.
I think what we can do to close the gap is going to be very different in inner London versus outer London. Inner London, there is not much spare land. And therefore, I think the way we're going to close the gap there is going to be much more finding ways to build parklets and these small patches of green space, which are often very valued by people, particularly if the long-term decline in car driving and in London continues. There's going to be a lot of car parking space available for those parklets. And I think many of the ones that have been developed recently are already much loved only a few years after opening. In outer London, I think there's much greater opportunities to build proper new nature reserves. And I would direct your attention to a Liberal Democrat council in Kingston, who are building on Tolworth Court Farm, a 43-hectare new nature reserve, which has these fantastic hedgerows going back hundreds of years. It's already got brilliant biodiversity. It's got brown hair streak butterflies, which are apparently very nice. Wood mice, bats, field voles, deer, herons, little egrets. And I think that's one of the things we can do a lot more of outer London. A patch of ground isn't just green because it looks green. Actually, it's because it has biodiversity, it has creatures living on it.
Thank you. Right, we're going to move on to the third question from Footways and London Living Streets. The recent government review of low traffic neighbourhoods found they could have significant benefits and recommended that local authorities carry out appropriate consultation. Will you, in principle, support boroughs that are introducing low traffic neighbourhoods and consulting with their residents? Emma, could you respond on this one?
Yeah, of course. And this is the point in the evening where everyone can boo and hiss if they want, but I'm probably going to be the least supportive in the audience. But I think there's a really clear line to say that when people do low traffic neighbourhood schemes well, when they work, when they're done in consultation with residents, when they don't stop public transport moving, when they don't redirect traffic into streets with some of where we know some of the poorest people in London work, they can be a very good thing. And unfortunately, we've seen too much of the opposite in London. So Susan is committed to addressing that and making sure that those low traffic neighbourhoods that haven't worked come out. But that doesn't mean that we don't agree to the principle of low traffic neighbourhoods where they are working, where they are increasing active travel, where they aren't just pushing the traffic into somebody else's road and making it someone else's problem. And I think that's the really key thing in that point, is just to make clear that when they work, they can be a good thing, but where they don't, for example, we've just seen in Streatham, nobody wants buses that can't make the end of their journey. Nobody wants people in some of the most deprived high streets feeling the fumes of all these cars being pushed into their roads. And so we do have to address and be honest about where they haven't worked and support where they have.
Thank you. Leonie?
So low traffic neighbourhoods are a proven tool to improve the city, and well-designed low traffic neighbourhoods will continue to receive support from Sadiq Khan. They clearly reduce road danger, traffic, tackle the climate crisis, improve air quality. Properly planned and delivered, LTNs are one of the quickest and cheapest ways to achieve all of these aims. There is evidence showing that people who live within an LTN tend to do over an hour's further exercise a day and more than 40 minutes more cycling, as well as driving less. Obviously safer because there's less vehicle movement, so traffic injuries declines. Under Sadiq Khan, TfL has supported boroughs already through guidance and financial support to deliver safe, integrated and efficient transport schemes via the LIP process, the local implementation plan process, and sharing data between boroughs to help them identify where LTNs might be beneficial. However, there have been a lot of scare stories spread about them, and I think it is important where they go in that they are, as I said, effective and properly planned and delivered. And Sadiq will continue to help the boroughs ensure that their approach is informed by the best advice and design to ensure that all residents benefit.
Thank you. Rob?
Thank you. I'm slightly skeptical of the hour a day of exercise. I can't quite believe that's true, because if it was, it would be one of the most successful public health things ever. I generally think LTN is great. My old road LTN was introduced. It's extremely successful. However, we do have to bring people with us. In democracy, we have to persuade these people are good. These things are good. And the truth is, for some LTNs, most obviously in Streatham recently, there's been a public perception that they have been unhelpful. In Streatham, actually, what people were getting very wound up about was the buses getting delayed. And so I think the only option here is to do high quality research that isn't just about post-rationalizing why it's good after you've brought it in, but actually tells us what elements of an LTN work well, in what circumstances do they work well, what are the things you can do to make them work better. And that's what I think we've been missing from up to now.
Great. Thank you. Zoe?
Thanks. The Greens have been very strong supporters of any measures that support clean air and make areas safer and more livable and more enjoyable. But I do think it needs to be done in a really fair way. So we need to look at how the most people can benefit for these and how we link them up and make sure that they're safe across the board. Because I know that that's feedback I get in my ward. My ward had a low traffic neighbourhood put next to it, and I spent a lot of time listening to people about what the concerns were. And a lot of those were things that are quite solvable, like people needed cycle storage, because that's why they couldn't use a bike and you had a car. And I think it's really listening to people about how we solve the things that are the issues, rather than just taking a blanket, pull them all out approach. I also think, so Sian on the Assembly, so Sian Berry on the Assembly has been pushing the Mayor to be able public support for low traffic neighbourhoods, making sure that he's offering the support to boroughs and pushing for that more visible and loud commitment to support boroughs to navigate some of the difficulties in implementing the low traffic neighbourhoods. I also have been pushing my borough to bring in a main road strategy to make sure that they've actually got a strategy to alleviate the pressures that are on the more main roads, because we do need to keep reviewing and listening and making the changes that people need to see so that as many people as possible can benefit.
Thanks very much. We're going to move on to the fourth question then from the environmental charities. This is from the London Friends of Green Spaces Network. Are you in favour of public green spaces being properly maintained and protected? If so, can you commit to supporting the Parks Charter, calling on all levels of government to ensure this happens? Rob, I'm going back to you.
Yes, I'm very happy to call on people to maintain parks properly. We actually, as the Liberal Democrats, passed a policy paper last year called Tackling the Nature Crisis that called for exactly this. So rather than talk on at you for 3 or 4 minutes telling you what it said, I encourage you to look at our website and find about it in more depth.
Okay, thank you. Leonie.
I'd have to take another look at the charter before I committed the mayor to saying that he would support it. So I'm not going to say that the Mayor of London is going to support the London Friends of Green Spaces charter. However, I think it's fairly obvious that the mayor has been supporting protections for the Greenbelt, metropolitan open land and a rewilding revolution for the capital, and is very keen to see as much nature protected across London as possible, and has been working with a lot of local groups. And the London Friends of Green Spaces is hosted in City Hall. So I can't imagine that you know, we're not going to continue to support the group in general, whilst I can't comment on the charter. I wish I'd read it again before I came this evening. Apologies for that.
Emma.
I'm going to plead my innocence of not being the mayoral candidate as well. But what I can say is I have the mayoral's researcher right here, and I think that we can make sure that they look through that charter and get a detailed answer back to the organisation of what they agree with and what they don't. But I mean, on the sound of it, right, it's like who votes against chocolate cake. So it sounds like a good thing, but I think we need to know the recipe and make sure that the mayor can sign. Oh, I'm getting ahead of myself, not the mayor yet, but that our mayoral candidate can sign up.
Thank you, Zoe.
So any project needs maintenance built into it. I think we've seen large tree planting programs where the maintenance hasn't been built in and the trees have died. So I think building maintenance into any project is essential. I also think this is recognizing that volunteers aren't free, and a lot of the we can't just assume that people are going to take on the maintenance of areas. Friends of Parks and Friends of Green Spaces do incredible work. So just appreciating anyone who's a volunteer that looks after any green space or does anything to look after parks or anything in your local area. But I know from all the work I've done in the voluntary sector as well as in the health service that we need to make sure that any even reliance on neighbourhood groups or friends groups needs to be properly supported. So I'm sure, not obviously knowing all of the details, but anything that calls for the government to recognise that and just calls for more investment into those activities, I think is something we can support. Thank you.
Thanks, Zoe. And it sounds like we've got the Parks Charter is going to be much better read as a result of today's activities. Right, the final question from the charities is from Sustain, slightly longer one this. Cities like London are dependent on food supply from elsewhere, and we could be doing a lot more to increase the amount of food grown for consumption in London, both domestically and in community and larger scale farms in the Greenbelt. How will you use your influence, planning powers, and funding streams to challenge the current barriers there are to accessing land for more food growing in the Greenbelt? Leonie, I'm going to come to you first.
Yeah, so this is something that Sadiq has tried to support as much as possible, I think, in the sense that there has been funding through a number of the different funds that he's set up to ensure that there's been a lot of fruit trees planted, and also trying to analyse how many of the green spaces across London where there are community groups who want to set up community gardens have received that funding. So there's been the funding for the bigger schemes that I mentioned earlier, but through the Green and Resilient Spaces Fund, but there's also then been the much smaller funds through the Grow Back Greener Fund. People in the room may in fact have applied for it, and that's been £3.5 million of funding that has gone to 100 grassroots community projects to do all sorts of projects, and focusing again, I think, on the areas of deprivation has been a key part of where that funding has gone. And it's so important, I think, also some of the information that's going into schools, because one of the things that we need for the future, where children are brought up in an urban environment and don't necessarily understand where food comes from, I think it's really important that as much as possible schools are able to give them that information. And there's a lot of growing projects have been set up now for growing salad and herbs in schools, sitting alongside the mayor's
project of funding free school meals at primary level, which I think is really, really important, that there's a much better closeness to food growing.
Thank you, Leonie. I'm going to go to Emma.
Yeah, thank you for this question, which is a really important one, and one that's actually not recognised enough. And we've actually been fairly positive this evening, so I'll give my first hit on the mayor, which is the accelerated pathway to net zero 2030 has so many aspects of it which are nowhere near being hit, nowhere near the mayor making the efforts to which they need to be hit. But one of the key things that isn't in that is the supply of food, and looking at where London gets its food, which is such an important part of this equation. And maybe this is uncouth in hustings, but I'll shout out to my colleague, Assembly Member Polanski, who's here. I think there's not been two more greater champions of London's food sustainability. And this is something that will have to be incorporated in any pathway to net zero, and people have to start looking at this properly. And in terms of outer London, people always look at me funny when I talk about rural London, but if you've been down to places like Bexley or up to Havering, you know there are places in London where we can really grow food and we can really become sustainable. Not for the whole of London, of course, we're not going to be feeding our entire population from London's farming space, but we can do so much more, and that has to be recognised as part of any future for net zero for London.
Okay.
And that's something that I've pushed with Susan. I'm still trying to push her to be a vegan. That's not going as well, but I think on this that it's something that she certainly recognises has to be part of London's future.
Thank you. There are vegan options available. Rob.
I think one missing part here, it's been neglected for a long time, is allotments. I spent a huge chunk of my childhood on my granny's allotment, and when I grew up, I kept on going there, mainly to eat her food and drink her wine, and to get her wonderful company, but also to help her garden. And she had so many happy years on that allotment. It's fantastic for people's well-being, but it's also brilliant for biodiversity. Things like compost heaps are phenomenal for bugs. And so we want to boost allotments a lot. And right now in London, the waiting list for allotments is 11 years on average. If you're in Camden, so it's just around the corner from here, it's 18 years. You know, you can be born and you're only an adult when you get on the get your allotment. And we think there's a way to solve that, which is government owns lots of plots of land where it currently has little crap lawns. These lawns are actually quite bad environmentally. Sometimes herbicides use them, and very often you're wasting a lot of time mowing them. Actually, those can be turned over to allotments and can bring lots of joy to people rather than just sitting there doing very little useful.
Okay, thank you. And Zoe.
I've got the absolute luxury of living on an estate that's got small spaces that we've been able to take over to grow food. So it's a part of our whole estate, like get involved and grow food and share it. We grow hops and make beer. It's absolutely joyful and everyone gets involved. I was actually pruning fruit trees at the weekend. One of my favourite things to do. But I think, you know, this really does speak to the heart of making sure that that is more accessible to as many people as possible when using as much space as possible. I was quite clear in my introduction that we really support the green belt and protecting that for things just like this, like having more farms, more food growing, and it being absolutely the perfect place for that. And Caroline Russell, who's also in the room, to do another shout out to an assembly member in the room, did a report gold plating the green belt, which I completely stand by. I commit to the ask that's within the manifestos around creating 6 new large family friendly community farms that encourage growing and can, you know, like was said before, it's not going to solve the insecurity. We know that 40% of families in London experience food insecurity in 2022. It's not going to solve that, but it will go some way to connecting that and also using the green space in the way that we need to.
Thank you. Thank you for sticking time on answering the questions as well. So that's the end of the sort of set piece questions from environmental charities. We're going to change gear a bit now. It's a chance for you to ask questions, whether you are the people I'm looking at or the people who are online. The current plan, depending on how we go, is that we'll do these in batches of 2. We'll have one from in the room and one from online. So Rachel will be wandering around with the in-house mic, and Alice will be looking at what's happening online and asking the questions from people there. But Can I ask you, Alice, to also, I think you've got a question yourself from CPRE London.
So the one from CPRE London, some of you have already replied to, will you defend London's green belt where it is under threat, particularly in Enfield and Hounslow in their local plans?
Okay, so that's a pretty
So-
short, sharp one. It's got almost a yes/no one, isn't it?
I was going to add in though, how important is retaining metropolitan open land in London, particularly where it's under threat?
Okay, let's answer that one quickly. Then, Emma?
Yes. That was the answer you wanted to the
Zoe?
first one.
Oh, yeah,
But
yeah.
did you on the metro and metropolitan open land as well? I think,
yep.
sorry, this kind of comes into the previous question around sustainability and food and things we can do with our land and not just giving it away. And so actually metropolitan open land plays a really important part in that as well, which that's from Susan, not me.
Zoe?
Yeah, I think I've said a couple of times now that I fully support protecting the green belt. I think it's essential, including any scrappy pieces of land like the overgrown petrol stations, and just making sure that they're keeping them for biodiversity and just protecting them for the green and the good, because we know how much value and importance the green belt provides. And I think strengthening the London plan to protect metropolitan open space as well as the green belt is a priority.
Leonie?
Well, I'm not going to be able to start drafting the new London plan on behalf of the current Mayor of London right now in this hustings, as you'd appreciate. However, I think you'll be aware of the protections that are in the existing London plan, which were installed by the current Mayor from 2021 onwards, when it finally, well, in fact, it was 2020 when it became London Plan Intend to Publish. It was sort of in draft before it became the final London Plan. So I don't think there are details yet in terms of how the London Plan will be strengthened in terms of Greenbelt or metropolitan open land, but there definitely is no intention at all to water down what's already in there. So the protections are there at the moment, and as Alice knows, so that's something we've talked about often. It's something I've involved myself in, and I know the Mayor has as well. Thank you.
And Rob?
I'm a massive fan of protecting nature when it requires protecting. So I've campaigned with the Warren Farm campaign in Ealing, where the council wanted to build playing fields on an area that had skylarks and barn owls. Just yesterday, I was talking to campaigners in Lewisham about protecting open land there. And I generally feel that's true for the Greenbelt if it's environmentally valuable. There are fields out in the Greenbelt that are smashed to death by pesticides and herbicides. There are indeed airports in the Greenbelt. If somebody came to me and said, do you want to build some housing on an airport that's in the Greenbelt? I would be delighted to, because it would be more biodiversity, it'd be better for the environment. So in that circumstance, I would, but every other circumstance, I'll always go for the environment.
Thank you. Right, so in the room, who's got questions? Oh, they're starting. Well, I'm going to go for the ones that caught my eye at the front, and then I'll come to Alice for a question from online.
Thanks for the discussion so far. My name is Mark Cridge. I'm Director of London National Park City. The question I have is, at a time when we need to be, you're creating hundreds of thousands of rain gardens, removing paving, creating much more permeable surfaces to catch rainwater runoff, prevent flooding and so on. What practical steps can the campaigns take when their candidates become mayor to reduce the number of front gardens we're losing at an increasingly rapid rate as they're being paved over?
Thank you. And Alice, what have you got?
By some magic, I have the same question, which is how will you protect front gardens in London, given their importance for nature and flood
I
management?
thought we stage managed this, but no, we're not that good. Right, who's going to go for this? Let's have Rob first.
Okay, great. One of the main, so these two things which I think are driving conversion of front gardens in London right now. One of which is theft from cars, particularly catalytic converters, which in some bits of London has become a real problem for people. And sort of people feel their car is safer when it's closer to their house. It's like somebody herding their cattle, but people feel that way. Equally, electric car charging. For a lot of places, there's very little electric car charging infrastructure. It's actually very ambiguous whether or not you can put a cable out from your house across the pavement to the street. I think if we can crack those two things, we can reduce the demand to convert front gardens. And then where it does happen, I think one of the things we can do is demand that those new front gardens are permeable, so the rain sinks through. And I think if we can do that, we can at least make that problem less bad.
Thank you. Leonie?
Yeah, so I actually personally did quite a lot of work on trying to make sure that the London plan included the urban greening factor and the biodiversity net gain. And with the changes that came in from the 2021 plan, all the local authority plans now need to come into conformity with it. And they are gradually flipping over and starting to include stronger protections, because most front gardens and the allowing somebody to drive on and off over a crossover on the edge of the pavement, a drop curb to what most people would call it, it is in the hands of local authorities. So what we need are local authorities' local plans to come into conformity with the London plan and to strengthen their hands to try and stop this. It's not just about people parking cars on front gardens though, and making sure that we have this permeability. It's also people putting down AstroTurf, which I absolutely loathe and detest, because it might look green, but blimey, it's greenwashing in extreme. So I think we really need to also, there's an information piece here for Londoners, and we need to be giving people more advice as to why having London as a national park city is a great thing for people's health and also for the nature that surrounds us. But I feel that this is an area that we do need to continue to advise people about, so that they want to do it much less and they understand why they need those permeable surfaces there.
Thank you. Zoe?
Yeah, this is incredibly important considering we're at really high flooding risk, and I think that's terrifying. You know, we've had report after report that shows that London's woefully underprepared for the climate crisis and lacks climate resilience. So I think it's really important to make sure that people are really aware of that and understand the risks. And as others have said, make sure those planning structures and tools and levers all hang together and make sure that, you know, we're protecting that space as much as possible. I also think it is speaking to people about what their concerns are, things like EV charging and making sure that that's accessible on the not on the pavement, in the road, not cluttering the pavement. And just making sure that policies hang together, because we've got, you know, councils having to make really difficult decisions about how people's green waste gets collected and increasing the charging for that. And I think it's just making sure that all of these policies make sure that we're all pushing in the same direction.
Thank you. Emma?
So I've got the lucky honour of going last, and everyone's basically said everything that can be said, right? So it's obviously not just front gardens, it's back gardens. I think you said that, Leonie. It's about obviously electric charging points now, and the fact that people want to do something good and go and buy an electric vehicle, but then they get the catch-22 of now I need to charge that and I need to bring that closer to my home. So it's about extending electric charging points. But I would say Susan's point that she's been really big on in her land, and this is about increasing London's home ownership and why home ownership is important and getting people their own pocket of land. And it's kind of finding the balance between not telling people what they can and can't do, but using that convening and that powerful leadership role to tell people why you don't want to put AstroTurf over your back garden and why you want to consider the surface with which you have on your front garden. And so I think actually this is one of those really important points where it comes down to, I think the way we're only going to go forward as future is not by beating people with sticks and telling them what they can't do, but it's by showing them the carrots and what they can achieve. And I think this front garden and back garden is a really tight one on that, and finding the balance on leading people to better change, but not restricting their autonomy with their own garden and front pocket of land.
Great, thank you. Question about there's one right at the back there.
Thanks very much. I'm really proud as a Londoner that all children get free school meals. Primary school children get free school meals. But that food that we buy could be doing so much to support nature-friendly farming. So could the panel say what they would do around procurement of free school meals to make sure that it supports nature-friendly farming and tackling the climate and nature emergency? It'd be great if you could also confirm that you would continue to support free school meals for children while you're here. Thanks.
Okay. And Alice, have we got any others online?
I have a question about removal of trees. How would you go about halting the removal of trees? From one woman who said that 200 trees have been removed in her ward alone, and that's legal removal for various reasons, not illegal removal of trees, so legal removal for various reasons.
Okay, so there's a couple there. Zoe, do you want to see what you can pick up?
Great. So on food, I'm fully committed to continuing to provide the primary school meals and also extending that to secondary school children. It's a commitment that I've recently made and I think is incredibly important, as I said earlier, to tackle the 40% of families who are experiencing food insecurity and just making sure that children have access. I tend to go a bit nerdy on local authority and public sector procurement because it's what I've got a background in. And I have worked on ensuring that we're maximising the social value in any contract, because I think that we need to just make sure that we're maximising any value from the climate to social and workers' rights, and just making sure that procurement makes sure we can leverage as much of that as possible. So we do support thinking about it being kind of plant-based as a default and just making sure that all of that ethical supply would be in place. I won't go on too much more about procurement, but fully interested in public sector procurement. And I think the removal of any tree is heartbreaking. I absolutely adore trees. I self-define as a tree hugger, and I think that we should do as much as possible to hold people to account in the removal of any trees. I found out recently that councils can remove trees without any consultation if it's on their land, and I think that that needs to be held to account. I've also pushed back on trees being demolished in developments, and just also really making sure that we've got those public records and a place where people can hold that to account, because I think the loss of trees, is really heartbreaking.
Emma.
Yeah, thank you. So firstly, to pick up the free school meals, obviously the Conservatives have a proud record on free school meals, going back to introducing with the Liberal Democrats as well, under the coalition, the first free school meals for Key Stage 1. And it was one of the first things that Susan did when she became the mayoral candidate, was announced that she would be extending free school meals into the future. And since that point, when she announced that in last summer, I think I asked the mayor about 5 times whether he would commit to do the same and give schools that reassurance. He waited and waited and waited until we got closer to the election to announce that he, in fact, would do that too. And now has awkwardly gone and bought a placard to put on a bus saying that the Conservatives are against these free school meals when we were the first ones to say that they would support them. So just to get the facts straight on that, I think going into the procurement, sounds like we can have a very interesting topic on this. And so I think it kind of forms again Susan's pledge to maintain the 200 farms in London and do all we can through procurement, through the GLA and the mayoral team to support them. I don't know the intricacies of her policies of how we could. Sorry, I forgot. I was trying to look at who the answer. But it was certainly, I think, something that she would love to pick up with you is how we could create that relationship and do that. Especially going on to the trees. Yeah, I mean, the loss of trees is devastating. We've seen in my borough in Waltham Forest, hundreds of trees cut down recently. And actually, if you look at the tree equity map, you can see that real picture of where we're losing trees and where there's not that tree coverage in London. And I think one of the things that I find really sad about this is it's hard to be an expert. So when an officer comes through and says this tree is diseased, I'm cutting it down, you know, neighbours will look around and say, but it looks perfectly fine, and what's the matter? And so I do think there's something in there as a convening power for the mayor to be able to give that information on how you can protect your trees, how you can see if something's diseased, and how you can fight your corner for your trees as a resident. But it's also about repopulating those trees and making sure when you look at that tree equity map, you just see a flurry of green.
Thank you. Well,
on trees, obviously, anytime a tree is lost unnecessarily is a tragedy. Where I live in Lambeth recently, actually, the council's been in an incredible situation where it's been cutting down more trees than it's been planting. And I think there's probably 2 underlying problems we need to solve. One of which is making sure that the trees that belong to the councils are better looked after. Because often by the time they do get to a point where they're dangerous, actually there probably is nothing that can be done. But that's not to say something could not have been done earlier to look after that tree. I think the second thing is we need to really understand better with the insurance companies what they're worried about, because very often the councils are cutting down trees because they're worried their insurance company won't pay out if the tree falls down and damages something. And therefore there needs to be a better lining up so that the councils are doing what the insurance companies need to feel comfortable with trees. Both of which are really the same problem the public sector has generally, which is we're very good at building things in the public sector. We tend to be very bad at maintaining them. And of course, maintaining something, failing to maintain something is very, very expensive in the long run. And what we started to do in the public sector is to measure whether or not we're maintaining things. And once you start to measure those things, you start to get and treat it properly. We actually need to do the same with trees. The tree stock of councils needs to be measured properly, so we look after them properly.
Okay, well,
Free school meals.
go on quickly.
Obviously, I'm very enthusiastic about free school meals because it was the Lib Dems who brought in free school meals for people. One of the things I think we can do in my day job, I advise sustainability companies who are technology companies, and one of the ones I work with are helping link together farmers and the people who buy food to cut out the middlemen and to make that system more efficient. And one of the things I found fascinating is, firstly, farmers get an incredibly bad deal out of the current system because so much food gets wasted, because the grapes will get shipped from, I don't know, France to Britain. They'll get to Britain, they'll get rejected. And by that point, it's too late to sell them to somebody else. So they just get thrown away. The farmer doesn't get the money. The retailer doesn't get the grapes are wasted. The great thing we have now with technology is it's reasonable for the public sector to start to demand from the people they buy foods from, that they can say, where does the food come from? And what are the environmental standards of those farms?
Going to move us on, Rob?
Yeah, sorry, I'll just say, and what we can start with that, and then you can move on to actually enforcing those standards.
Thank you. Right, I know there's a question at the end on the second row there. Rachel, if you want to go over there. We'll do our best to get to people.
Okay.
Can see lots of hands, I am trying. And Alice, if you can be ready for online.
Hi, Cy Diamond from Community Energy London. The Mayor produced a report about 10 days ago showing really good progress by local authorities in collecting carbon offset funds. So that at the end of 2022, boroughs had collected and secured £243 million in funds with close to £100 million in their pockets, which is all ring-fenced for only climate reduction projects. They can only use that money for reducing carbon in their borough. That was at the end of 2022. It's probably more like 350 million and 130 million in their pockets now. How can a new mayor ensure that that money continues to come in its best use, not only within the borough, but cross borough as well? Thank you.
Alice, how are we going online?
So there's a question online, which is that we want to hear your specific commitment in terms of net zero. So what are you committing to and by when?
Great. Emma, do you want to kick off?
Emma, yes, sorry. This is why I was worried about the notes that people were making earlier, because I'm here desperately scribbling down your figures, so apologies. I think the really important thing when we look at carbon offsetting, though, is making sure we're not greenwashing in any area. And it's very, very easy to say we've collected and we've offset, but it's always better, I think, to look at how you're doing the thing in the first reason. I'll say that. But anyway, once we get to the carbon offset point, I think we need to really make sure that we understand every single project that's going to and how it feeds into London. We did an investigation in the GLA on how we were doing carbon offset when it came to the mayor's big transport kind of projects and flying off to America and things like that. And it turned out even within the GLA, we had no idea what our carbon offset fund was, where it was and how we were using it, and that's really scary. So I think it's actually getting a really good idea of not only from the local authorities but the GLA ourselves, how this money is spent and how it's not just benefiting the world but benefiting London. And I'm sorry, was there a second part that I missed?
Go for net zero now.
Oh, okay. And also on the net zero, I think actually the plan is to try and get to net zero as soon as possible. I don't think Susan's officially given a year, date, time to set your clocks to yet. But as soon as, so that's not so much that I'm not saying an answer. I don't want to sign up to a figure that hasn't been said, but hopefully you'll get that soon.
Leonie?
I'm not sure whether you deliberately didn't ask me the one about the free school meals and the removal of trees, but can I just take 1 minute to answer that one as well?
Apologies.
Just to say that obviously the budget setting process in City Hall, the budgets are announced in February, and last year the Mayor announced the current free school meals programme would start in September. And despite lots of requests for information in advance of the budget coming out in February of this year, the Mayor once again announced that there would be a budget for free school meals next year. And I think if he's re-elected, you can draw your own conclusions about what might be announced next February in the next budget. And obviously the procurement issue is complex, and it would be nice to think, and actually Sustain were very interesting when they've come into City Hall to talk to us about this. It would be really nice to think that we could change the procurement and the logistics of the way food comes into London. But I think that's not a simple answer that I could give in any short amount of time. In terms of the removal of trees, there's been quite a sea change in the way that some of the constituent bodies, and particularly TfL, Transport for London, which has a lot of public realm under its control, and the Mayor has been very keen to see that where possible, when roads are being renewed or changed, that new trees are being introduced, that swales and bunds are also being introduced. And I think that's a really important principle. And I think it's also really important that the urban greening factor element of, as well as biodiversity net gain in the London plan, as that's reflected into the local plans, will strengthen people's hands in terms of trying to resist the removal of trees. But sometimes they do still need to come out because they are diseased, and then they can't be stopped. In terms of local authorities collecting carbon offset funds, as I think Said knows, I've spent quite a lot of time twisting the Mayor's arm over the issue of community energy. And there's at one point, the Mayor of London was the only body in the country, the GLA, was giving out London community energy funding. And there's a new fund has been announced of 700,000. And City Hall has been working with boroughs so that they can set up their own local community energy funds. There's about 8 boroughs have set them up now. And so a proportion of the carbon offset funding is now going into community energy, which I think is a really excellent way of using carbon offset funding. Obviously, there's a lot of other projects, sustainable urban drainage, just to mention something that we've touched on a bit earlier, is susceptible to use there. In terms of net zero, the Mayor has commissioned Element Energy to produce a big report to see how we could get London to net zero. And just 2 points on that. The accelerated green pathway is the pathway from that report that's been chosen. And more work definitely needs to be done on that. More money needs to be spent on it, which is why the Mayor has been looking at where can we get that money in from, because it's quite clear that the amount of money that's required to really get to net zero cannot all come from the public purse. And has been looking to raise money and has now started distributing it through his Green Finance Fund. And the key here, I think, is partnerships. During COVID, we set up a way of working that brought all the anchor institutions, yet another phrase that needs to come into the vocabulary, and that has now been converted into the London Partnership Board. And that is looking at how we achieve, the best way forward into this, at the moment, quite uncertain future. And I think partnerships will be really critical here.
Is there an answer to the by when in that, Leonie?
Sorry?
By when on net zero?
Well, the Mayor's already announced that he wants to accelerate and hit net zero by 2030.
Right.
Sorry, I mentioned that earlier.
Yeah, thank you.
The Mayor's, as Leonie says, has said 2030. We crunched some figures recently on how he's getting along, because obviously he became Mayor in 2016, now 2024. So it's more than halfway through that period to 2030. He's going to come nowhere near that target. If you draw a straight line through what he's been doing, you get to about 2038. I would like to get to 2030. And I think actually going to the community energy point, that's going to be one of the big things we can do, which we can raise more money for community energy. And the great thing about a lot of green investments, particularly solar, is they have a nice steady return for many years on end. And people like pension funds like to invest in that. And I think there's a real opportunity to unlock that pension fund money for solar on roofs in London. CPRE has actually done some excellent reports on the amount of roof space available in London to put solar on. One of the things I'd say is also solar at home for people is highly efficient, because people can use it for their own heating, their lighting, or their daily electricity. As we decarbonize, we're going to use more electricity. Now, local energy networks struggle to put lots more electricity down them. But if you get it off your roof, you don't have to go through the grid. So it's incredibly efficient that way as well. So I think solar on roofs is one of the ways we can spend that money, but it's also one of the ways we can raise that money. And it's one of the ways we can get to net zero either by 2030 or not long afterwards.
Thanks so much, Zoe.
So being the Green Party, the climate emergency and the planet is at the absolute heart of every decision that we make. So yes, it's about projects and making sure we have a pipeline of those projects, and that's incredibly important. And we are committing to get there as soon as possible. I think we've got various timescales for different things within the manifesto, but obviously wanting to meet that by latest 2030. But because this next term of mayor is absolutely crucial to addressing the climate emergency. We are seeing, rapid warming, and I think London taking its part as a climate leader in this space is really, really important. And I'm really glad for the community energy question. I was part of projects within the NHS of getting solar panels on car parks and GP practices and working with the community energy, amazing local organisations. I think that's really, really exciting. Also, we need to, there's loads we need to be doing to address things that are producing carbon. So yes, we've all talked about kind of mitigating and offsetting, but we need to stop things like road building. And, the Greens have been at the forefront of saying that the Silvertown Tunnel should never been built. And Sean Berry put forward many consultations with residents about the repurposing of that tunnel. So I think it's all about doing as much as possible, keeping the climate at its centre to all decisions we make, taking in social, financial, but as well as climate decisions. And that's what our Green Mayor would do.
Thank you. Right. Rachel, there's one in the middle on the pile here. And I am going to go for one other in the room as well, the back on the right.
Thank you, Tony. Jeremy Leach from London Living Streets. In 2022, the Mayor stated that to hit the net zero target in 2030, traffic volumes needed to fall by 27% from their 2018 levels. What policies will the candidates introduce in order to hit that target? Thank you.
Thank you. And back right, on my right.
Thank you. I'm Erica Popwell from River Action. Thank you for that earlier question. Thames Water was wasting 600 million litres of water a day at the moment. The estimated cost to the London economy if we ran out of water would be £330 million a day. What should you be doing as Mayor to ensure that consumers across London and businesses are supported to be more efficient with their water use?
Great. Zoe.
Sorry, I was at Age UK hustings earlier, and it's very logical, and it went down the line. So this is far more uncertain. You don't know what's going to happen. So yes, fully committed to hitting that 27% target in terms of reducing the traffic kilometres. I was working on the manifesto at the weekend, and that's exactly the target that we're hitting. We want to see a transformation in the way that people move around the city. We're failing in comparison to some of the other European cities, and there's a whole host of things which I do not have time to completely rattle off now, but I think it's part of, obviously we've talked about the inner and outer London disparity and making sure that we're doing as much as we can in inner London, and we've talked about making that kind of people first and space for people, so making it a car-free space. We committed to that in 2021, and it will be in our manifesto again. And then in outer London, it's all about creating better transport links. I've talked about making transport more affordable, especially free bus travel for under 22s and bringing back the pre-9 a.m. Travel for older people, which at the Age UK session today was a really, really important thing to bring back in. And it's all about obviously making, our transport chapter in our manifesto is all about equity, fairness, affordability, and putting those at the heart of helping people to make choices away from private cars. I'm speaking really quickly because there's loads I want to say about transport and making walking infrastructure. So obviously we went walking around, looking at what good and poor walking infrastructure looks like. So making sure that that's as accessible as possible too. And Thames Water, I think we talked about this earlier, and just being a really strong voice in holding Thames Water to account. I think that's absolutely shocking that they're able to leak that much water. I think all of us will feel really, I feel bad if I leave the tap on brushing my teeth. So the sort of that amount of water being leaked out just makes me despair. And I think making sure that they're being held to account, and this is just absolutely unacceptable, I think.
Okay, great.
I can't see you, but yeah.
Yeah. Leonie.
So the Mayor's transport strategy, the MTS, was introduced in 2018. And it set out a target then that 80% of all journeys should be made by active travel or by public transport. And so investment has continued apace into London's transport, including most recently Superloop to provide better bus connections in outer London, which was essential. But also there's more electric buses, there's more hydrogen buses. I think there's now 25% of all of the electric vehicle charging points and nationally and now in London. So there's been a massive shift also in the way that the LIP money, which I mentioned earlier, local implementation plan funding that goes to local authorities, who obviously most of the roads in London, 95% of the roads are controlled by the local authorities, only 5% are part of the Transport for London road network. And the LIP funding now goes to authorities who are undertaking schemes that will promote the active travel, the walking and the cycling that we really, really do need to see, because we're never going to hit that 27% reduction that Jeremy referred to if we're not really serious. And I think if you look around London, you can see how different it is. I mean, I've got the figures for, you know, the numbers of kilometres of new cycle lanes that have gone in and so on and so forth, but that doesn't include all of the work that the local authorities have done. And I think it really, London really has changed since 2016. More of that would continue for absolutely sure if Sadiq Khan is re-elected on the 2nd of May. In terms of Thames Water, we did talk about this earlier, but I do think your point, actually, the last time we spoke to them, and that's Emma, myself and Zach as the Environment Committee, we've been having some private, fairly strenuous conversations backing up the work of the mayor and the deputy mayor on this, of holding them to account, actually. They're down from the 600 million litres per day, but they've gone down to 580 million litres a day. Well, we had them in between 2016 and 18 when I was chairing the Environment Committee then, and they were at 500 litres a day then. So they are definitely going in the wrong direction. But it is tackling leakage, but it is also, as you rightly pointed out, some issues about behaviour change. Most Londoners think that London is filled with water. We're as dry as Dubai. We do actually need to take some personal responsibility here. And so people who spend hours you know, watering their gardens rather than actually putting in a water butt and doing some water saving. I think some people are irresponsible with water, partly because it vanishes down the plug, so you can't see that it's there. But we do need to start treating water as the precious resource that it really is, as well as making it cleaner, obviously, in the rivers. Thank you.
Thanks. On cutting traffic, we need to get a better working public transport system. And I think one of the real problems of the last 8 years has been a lot of instability in Transport for London. When the mayor came in, he did a fares freeze on single fares. It took £640 million out of Transport for London. And that money is not the money you find down the back of a sofa. And the consequence of that is bus routes being cut by 18 million bus kilometres. And those buses are what lower income Londoners tend to rely on. And that has been a real problem. But even if we fix that, we're still going to have a big challenge. And the other thing I would direct your attention to is the ability of us to change people's behaviour. Right now, for a lot of people, particularly in outer London, driving a car always seems and feels like the easiest option. And I know this well. My younger daughter is basically very lazy and constantly lobbies me to come and pick her up from things. And I have to fight her for it. One of the things that government isn't doing very well right now is giving people personalised advice on what transport options they have to try and change people's behaviour one by one. We still do a very traditional thing as we just say, use the tube, use the train, use the bus. Actually, what works for different people will be very different, and government is still quite poor at doing that. We know from behaviour change campaigns, it is possible to change people's behaviour. I particularly liked an example done in California, where everyone on the street got told the electricity usage of themselves, but also the average for all of their neighbours. First time they did that, by the way, all the people above average cut their electricity usage very quickly, the way you'd want. Unfortunately, all the people who are below average increase their electricity usage. So you have to do it in exactly the right way.
And water?
And on water, actually, a lot of behaviour change is a large part of that. But one other thing on top of that is for Thames Water is in a terrible structure right now. It's having money extracted from it by its ultimate owners in a way it's very, very hard to stop. We really need to take it into administration. It's going to go bankrupt at some point anyway. We might as well do it now and take control of the problem.
Thank you, Emma.
Thank you. On the traffic volumes, it is literally the opposite of rocket science. It's the most basic and obvious answer at all. People will choose travel options at the cheapest and quickest option for them. So we've talked a lot about inner and outer London. It's not just inner and outer, it's central, inner and outer London. If someone is travelling from outer to inner to central, they're very rarely going to drive. If they're travelling from inner to central, they're very rarely going to drive. And inner to outer, you're very rarely going to drive. But, and this is a weird thing for politicians to sometimes get their head around, but people don't live their lives within ward boundaries and regional boundaries. And actually, occasionally, people might venture outside of London. So Leonie mentioned that things have changed since 2016. They certainly have. And if you look in outer London, they've got a hell of a lot worse. So for example, I live in northeast London. One of the main reasons that people live in northeast London, where I do, in places like Chingford, is because they want to get to places like Harlow, Waltham Abbey, and further out into Essex. We've had our buses cut to go to Waltham Abbey. You cannot get there by public transport anymore. And that's one of the things that wants to come back. And I'm glad we've mentioned the super loop, or the super flop, as I will call it every single time. Because when you look in my region, it doesn't go into outer London. Actually, it provides the same journey length that you could already do by public transport. What you needed is places like Chingford and Romford being linked up, because for me, it would take me 30 minutes by car to get to Romford from my house. It would take me an hour and 40 minutes to do that journey by public transport. And so it is not rocket science. Cheapest, quickest public transport options, and people will take them. It's not about wanting to drive all the time, although I do have kids as well that would like that option all the time. But it is about the quickest and cheapest option. And if we give people those options, they'll take it. And on the question around the water, I think perhaps we've actually worked really well as an environment committee, bringing Thames Water in and putting them to task over their leakage. And yeah, it's shocking. I think that there's going to be probably some big announcements around that in the next few months. But for now, I think all we can do is convene and work with them and certainly tell them what they know is the leakage is unacceptable. And how do you tell people when we see this, million tonnage of wastage every day, to turn the tap off and brush their teeth? Because people are just going to think, what's the point? When they see their street flooding in front of their eyes, why are they going to think I shouldn't use the hose in the garden? And so it's a real problem with behaviour change if from the top we can't stop leakage.
Thanks so much, Emma. Right, two more in the room. So there's one in the middle there, and the guy with his hand up there.
Thank you. Andrew Bosey, London Forum. I'd like to ask the two candidates whether they have any qualms that a vote for them might split the environment vote with consequences they wouldn't like. And I'd like to ask the two representatives, when they listen to how they'd respond, when they listen to people who say the most important things to me are stopping the Silvertown Tunnel and introducing road pricing. And I can't see how any vote will bring those about.
Same row, no, for that, yeah.
Bruce Cadbury from FOG. At the moment in Westminster, we have all been converted into composting, and it's brilliant because that means that the amount of rubbish that goes into the bins, the weight is hardly noticeable these days. It's all going into compost. However, I'm really disappointed. It goes off to Hertfordshire, where they get the benefits of the actual compost and the gas and everything else that comes out of it. Will the candidates here guarantee that the compost from Westminster and perhaps the other boroughs gets processed in Westminster? We've got parks that could do with that compost. We've got community heating systems that could do with the gas from it. Will they commit to putting the product from that compost back into London?
And could you hand the woman next to you, please, as well? Because I know you wanted, yeah.
Hi, Susanna from Trees for Cities. Talking about trees again. How will you ensure that urban trees are kept at the forefront of climate adaptation tools for the capital? We talked a bit about mitigation, but what about adaptation?
Sorry, no, can you say it?
Say that again,
Yeah.
please.
Yeah, sure. How will you ensure that urban trees are kept at the forefront of climate adaptation tools for the capital? Thank you.
Okay, do we hear that? Right, I took three because I think there's some short answers to some of these. But Rob, do you want to kick off? And we've got us a 90-second window for this one.
Okay. On voting, I don't think there's any chance Conservatives will win here. They're in free fall in London the way they are everywhere else in the country.
Okay, move on.
I don't think the mayor I don't think the mayor deserves to win.
Yep.
Compost. I love the idea. I'm not sure about practicalities, but I'd love to hear more. And on trees, yes, I think we've got to choose the right trees for adaptation. And obviously, I'm incredibly aware of how incredibly important it is for trees to actually provide lots of shade, and how important that's going to become, and how living on a leafy street is going to move to being much more of a necessity than a nice thing to have.
Emma.
Yeah, I think so. There's 3 questions there, isn't there? So I think to start on the first one, I've always thought that you vote for who you vote for, and you should, and there's a reason you do that. My wife's a Liberal Democrat. I remember we live in a very marginal constituency, and she had a Labour person at the door saying, "You've got to vote for us or the Tories will win." And she's like, "I don't like either of you." And I think the fact that people think that, you have to respect that, and you have to vote how you want to vote. Onto the Hertfordshire, sorry, the problem with Westminster, you know, that's one actually for once I won't throw at the mayor's door. I think that there's a lot of lobbying that has to be done around our waste infrastructure in London. Anyway, the whole thing is a mess. There's a lot of crazy stuff like that. And I think actually the best thing for waste policy is to be made regionally across London. And I think that would actually make it easier to do things logistically that works much better. And I think there was something about protecting trees, which I think if you're worried about time, I'll just give that a simple yes, we will protect those trees. That's really important. And just to address the free fall comments, we just won an election in Hackney for one of the very first times. We went up in Enfield, we became the leaders of Harrow Council. People are not happy with their Labour leadership in London, and perhaps the polls tell you one thing, but I tell you, I've spent the last year knocking on people's doors, and that is certainly not the message that I'm getting.
Leonie?
I think it's really disappointing that the progressive voting systems that have been introduced at all levels by the last Labour government, that the one in London, which came in after the referendum where we said that we wanted to have a London government again, has now been unpicked, and that people have to make a straight choice. I would hope that if people are looking at the candidates, and even if they are feeling committed to voting Liberal Democrat or Green, that they feel able to lend the progressive Labour mayor their vote just on this occasion, because I don't think the Conservative candidate is at all progressive on many issues, including on the environment. I regret to say I would commend Emma far more than I would commend Susan for viewpoints around the environment. I don't think Susan has ever, I mean, I asked her once, why have you never substituted onto the Environment Committee? And she said, quite frankly, I'm not interested in the environment. I mean, you know, so that was Susan's view. But, you know, Susan is a real hard worker, and absolutely take my hat off to the work that she's done as an Assembly member. She's done more work almost than anyone else in the Conservative team, and she is absolutely, I don't want to say busting a gut because it sounds revolting, but you all know what I mean. She is really, really working very, very hard in this election. And I think there are a lot of people who are going to make up their minds who have not yet done so. And so I think it is going to be a close race between the Labour mayor and the Conservative challenger. So make your own decisions on that. In terms of composting and the waste arrangements in London, the mayor has powers of direction over disposal, but not over collection. And essentially, we need to have some more devolved powers and more devolved finance to sort out the mess that still exists across the whole of London. And I think keeping urban trees at the forefront of climate adaptation, if you look at the way that the London plan is and the changing way that TfL is approaching trees in its public realm, I think you'll see that the mayor is very keen to keep trees everywhere from TfL to National Park City, absolutely everywhere as part of our climate adaptation.
Zoe, thank you.
So I agree that the step back in the progressive way that people could have voted for the mayor in the first, second preference and it going to first past the post is tragic. And the Conservative government obviously brought that in without any vote a few years ago. And I think it's terrible. But the Green Party stand on our values, we stand on our policies, and we're proud of those. And I'm not going to wait in the wings for the right voting system to come along. But you do get the opportunity to vote in a proportional vote on the assembly ballot. And I think any votes on that translate into people, two of which we've got here, our wonderful Green Assembly members, and I'm number 4 on our list. I was counting just the Greens, but you can join in if you want, all these wonderful people. So I think there is that proportional element, and yeah, that's really important to know that your vote will count on that ballot. With the composting, yes, I think we need to solve all of standardize the approach to all of the waste collection and usage in the city. I think it's a total postcode lottery. We've also really opposed the extension of any incinerators. We've been really proudly and loudly saying that we can't be burning our waste, and we need to look at reducing the amount of waste going into incinerators, but also not expanding their capacity. And yes, anything to do with protecting trees, I'm a huge fan of, because I think that's incredibly important for their health, but also our health and well-being too.
Lovely, thank you. We're going to have this one final question from online.
So it had to be asked. I feel I have a child. My child has repeatedly been hospitalised by poor air pollution. I feel the ULEZ has had a direct impact on her breathing better and not being rushed in an ambulance. Would you commit to protecting the ULEZ? And also, what would you do to improve air quality, in particular around schools?
And one more in the room. How do I do this? Right at the front. It's on its way. It's on its way. You need that for online.
Given it's not working.
Yep.
Given the importance of public parks, and also that the majority of them are managed by local authorities who are facing budgetary cuts, and it's a non-statutory provision, so they've taken bigger cuts than most. What measures are the candidates going to do in order to guarantee better maintenance of public parks? And will they commit specifically to a fixed pooled proportion of community infrastructure levy to be allocated for that purpose?
Right, so ULEZ and parks. Emma, do you want to kick off?
Yeah, I can. It probably won't be a surprise, and probably won't be a surprise. And again, this is the opportunity to go and hiss, but the expanded ULEZ would not be safe under Conservative mayoralty. That'd be taken apart. Now, I would say, as somebody that has been actively opposed to the ULEZ, but extremely integrated in the fight for climate justice, and examples like Edmonton Incinerator we just talked about, this has been my problem with the ULEZ from day one, is that there's been an independent study, the TfL's own independent study said there would be a negligible impact on air quality through expanding the ULEZ. It comes back again to that reason why outer London is so different to inner and central. And you can see, I think, if there was this massive impact of ULEZ, then the mayor would be releasing those stats before the election. The reason he's not is because we knew in outer London this was never the silver bullet. It wasn't even a bronze or iron bullet to fix air pollution in outer London. But what I think will really help is looking at those really big I should say small but concentrated pollution hotspots that we have in London, and especially in outer London. And that's where Susan's £50 million pollution hotspot fund comes into play, which she will be spending on things like, I think schools were mentioned, and focusing on those really important areas where maybe it's traffic congestion or something else that's causing real issues with pollution. And certainly on the public parks, that's one of Susan's main priorities, is trying to make sure that we can not only maintain our public parks, but increase. On the specific commitment to SIL, unfortunately, I'm sure you're not surprised that that's not something I'd be able to commit to this evening, but I'm sure if you contact through the mayoral team, that they'll give you a direct answer.
Thank you. Zoe.
I missed the name of the person who was phoned in, who was online, but I'm really sorry to hear about your child's health. I've got asthma and I didn't go outside in the summer when it was incredibly polluted and high, so I know how crippling it can be to not be able to breathe clean air. And I'm really glad to hear that you feel that the ULEZ is making a difference. We've supported clean air measures for a long time. We would have brought in the expanded ULEZ when the first bit was brought in, so many years ago, and would have been working on the solutions to make sure people have got those alternatives to using a private car, like making public transport better in the outer London. So it's not, I think we talked about carrot and sticks. You've got to work with people and give them those options. But I also think there's some unfairness baked into the ULEZ charging. And I'd set about doing a consultation and working towards a pay-per-mile system, but making sure that really looking at how that would work for Londoners, the criteria and how that would look like would be talked about through the consultation. And anything, on public parks, I think the points you've raised are really, really important. I know from my own local council that they've been looking at changing the maintenance due to budget cuts. And I think it's excruciating to hear that those things and wild planting and things are being cut that are incredibly important to people's health and well-being. I can't commit to the specific on Sil, but I can get back to you on.
Thank you. Leonie?
ULEZ, as far as the current Mayor of London, if he's re-elected, is absolutely here to stay. And the scrappage scheme wasn't just about scrapping vehicles, but there were also a number of other things that were on offer in terms of mitigation and adaptation, some of which speak to the active travel, because there were sort of, free membership of car clubs, also Brompton bikes and so on and so forth. So I think, and I also say this as someone who lives in South London rather than North London, the ULEZ, even when it was expanded down to the South Circular barely goes much further south than the River Thames. So it wasn't just about expanding it to outer London. Actually, I live in an inner London borough, and it was 5 miles north of my house, because I'm in Tooting, so I'm right down in the south of Wandsworth, and the air pollution at Tooting Broadway was hideous. So I'm really proud that the Mayor made a difficult decision, very difficult decision, to expand the ultra low emission zone. And I'm very pleased to hear that I also didn't catch the person's name, that the child's health has improved. And the Mayor is partly inspired on this because he himself ran a marathon, and he did a lot of his training running along the side of Tooting Beck Road and inhaling traffic, and is now adult onset asthma afflicts him, so he has an inhaler of his own. So he is absolutely not going to be taking it out, and I think it's a jolly good thing it's gone in, and the world has been taking note of the improvements in our air quality. Putney High Street in my constituency, because I'm not one of the London-wide members, used to have a fight with Oxford Street and Brixton Road to be illegal the earliest, usually on the 1st or 2nd of January of every year. I launched the first low emission bus zone with the Mayor, and I was really proud to do that. And I'm also proud to say that he has absolutely taken the ball from those of us who've been air quality campaigners for a long time, and has taken this forward. And I think it's a really good thing. And he's done that in the teeth of the government taking a lot of money away from London, far more than Rob referred to in terms of freezing fares. Fares have been frozen to enable Londoners to use public transport. The government has taken the £500 million a year that drivers pay in vehicle excise duty, has taken it into the Department of Transport and kept it. And finally, in terms of public parks, community infrastructure levy funding comes into local authorities, and they are free to choose what they do with it. I'm not sure it would really work out to say that they should all be told to spend a fixed percentage of it on parks, because that's going to be a recurring expenditure, whereas SIL only comes in as a one-off and is usually used for capital investment. The one thing I would say is that a lot of local authorities have been thinking really creatively about things like No Mow May and what they can do to think of a more natural approach to parks. So rather than having everything manicured, perhaps through being forced to look at these things, I think there has been a lot of creativity in turning parks into more natural spaces, which I have to say, I don't mind at all. Thank you.
And Rob?
Obviously, I'm a massive fan of parks. On the SIL issue, I'd like to hear more about that, maybe later. On ULEZ, I think it's an interesting thing of the Mayor. In his own words, he used to drive a gas guzzler, and then he got asthma and he got convinced of the need for clean air. And actually, that's a transition we need a lot of people to go through, which is not to get asthma, but to change their point of view. Really hope lots of people don't get asthma, but change their point of view. And actually, I think on the ULEZ, one of the problems we've had is the inner ULEZ was very successful because people had 3 years to adapt, and people had time to change from their old polluting car. The outer ULEZ struggled to take the public with it so easily because people had 9 months to adapt. And if we look at it right now, for cars, it's largely working quite well. 95% of people are compliant, but for vans, it isn't. And that's because a lot of people who have to drive a van for their living, if you're a tradesman who has to carry a lot of heavy stuff, you can't take that on the bus. You've got to have a van, and that process of adaptation has been much harder for people. And that's one thing I'd like to see better. And on the school, schools, I'd love to see how we can improve school streets.
Well, thank you. Thanks for responding to all the questions, and thank you for asking. We're going to move on to the closing statements now, which we'll take in the reverse order of how people spoke originally. So the order will be Leonie, Zoe, Rob, and Emma. And you've each got 1 minute for your closing statement. So I'll start with you, Leonie.
Thank you, Tony. It's a straight choice between Sadiq's positive vision to build a fairer, greener and safer London for everyone, or the vision that comes from Susan Hall, who doesn't, I think, share these values and has been an outspoken supporter of Brexit, Donald Trump, Liz Truss's mini budget that has allowed us to end up in this situation of having problems with our finances, has not argued strenuously enough with her colleagues in government to bring in the money that London needs to enable us to do what we need to do. Sadiq will continue the policies around protecting the Greenbelt, metropolitan open lands, and also feeding London's children, freezing fares, and trying to make sure that Londoners have the help that they need as we go through the cost of living crisis, so that we can come out into a brighter future on the other side. Thank you.
Thank you. Zoe.
So I'd just like to say a huge thank you to CPRE and all the organisations of their logos that I've been looking at all evening. So just thank you for putting forward all these incredible ideas. And I've heard loads of stuff from access and inequality to green space, protecting the green belt, holding Thames Water to account, all the food growing stuff we were talking about at the beginning. And I'd be absolutely delighted to be able to represent you and do more at London level. I listen to Londoners, I respond to their needs. I've got a plan to make things better, and support for Greens are growing, and you can vote for us on all 3 ballots on the 2nd of May. Thank you.
Thank you. Rob.
Thank you very much for having us all here tonight. The Conservatives aren't going to win this election. They are way behind, and I think their record speaks for itself. But I'm in this race based on a 30-year record of environmental action to hold the Mayor to account. And I think the Silvertown Tunnel, the motorway under the Thames, tells you everything you need to know about his record. The fact that Labour are actually scared to say the word Silvertown says something about how they're embarrassed. And Khan's record on climate change is poor. I will lead an ambitious programme to tackle climate change if elected, and to get a more natural capital. Vote Lib Dem on the 2nd of May for a greener London, but also a London where everyone's enthusiastic about making these changes.
Lovely. Emma.
Thank you so much, everyone, for coming tonight and being here and making all your notes, because Susan Hall, if she wins, you will be the experts driving and leading this change. That is Susan's vision, is to listen to Londoners, listen to experts, and bring people from their field that can change London to make those decisions in City Hall to improve people's lives. Now, we heard earlier from Robbie, actually, that Sadiq Khan was on target for net zero for 2038. That's one of the most generous things that's been said this evening. But if you're into nice words and little action and false promises, then vote again for Sadiq Khan. If you want actual change, someone that listens, somebody is willing to say, I'm not the expert here, but you are, what can I do? Then vote for Susan Hall and vote for change. If you think we need more carrots, or you think we need to bring people on this journey and convene in the right way, vote for Susan. If you think we need less sticks, less division in the environment topic, then vote for Susan. Where you've got a West Midlands mayor in who's a Conservative, you'll see he's planted double the more trees. That's Conservatives in action as mayors, and we know that we can do it again. So please take a punt on Susan, even if it's not your regular chance, because it is a 2-horse race. And if you like fancy words and little action, then perhaps Sadiq Khan's your mayor for another 4 years. But if you want a chance at change, vote for Susan on the 2nd of May. Thank you.
Thank you all.
And vote for me, because I'm up for election as well.
Thanks to our candidates for coming along. Thanks for indulging us in our time limits. Thanks to everyone online for your contribution and for the questions you've asked, and also obviously to everyone who's attended this evening. But perhaps, dare I say, biggest thanks to the amazing volunteers behind this who've made this run so smoothly and who've gathered us all together. CPRE London has organised this event on behalf of More Natural Capital Coalition, so please do offer us all your support. Do get involved, but above all, don't forget to vote on May the 2nd.
And take your ID.
Yeah,